frozen Delaware River cracked under the weight of desperation as General George Washington stared across its icy expanse on the night of December 25th, 1776. His Continental Army, reduced to fewer than 3,000 men, huddled in makeshift shelters along the Pennsylvania shore. Their boots leaked, their uniforms hung in tatters, and their morale had plummeted to depths that seemed impossible to recover from. The cause of American independence appeared all but lost. Washington's weathered hands gripped a letter from Congress, its contents spelling out the dire reality. Enlistments would expire in just 6 days, on December 31st. Without a decisive victory to reinvigorate the revolutionary spirit, the Continental Army would simply dissolve into the winter night, leaving the dream of liberty to die with it. The British, under General William Howe, had systematically pushed the rebels across New Jersey, capturing fort after fort, town after town. Loyalist sentiment was surging as colonists began to believe that resistance was futile. The general's piercing blue eyes reflected the flickering campfires as he contemplated the impossible gamble that might save everything. His plan was audacious. Beyond reason, launch a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton, then push northeast to Princeton before British reinforcements could respond. It was the kind of strategy that could either resurrect the revolution or destroy what remained of it entirely. Colonel John Glover's Massachusetts. Mariners had been preparing their Durham boats throughout the evening, their experienced hands working despite the bitter cold that turned their breath to vapor. These were the same men who had evacuated Washington's army from Long Island earlier that year, proving their worth in the most desperate circumstances. Now, they would attempt something even more daring, ferrying an entire army across a river, choked with ice floes in the dead of winter. As midnight approached, the first boats pushed off from the Pennsylvania shore. The crossing would take 9 grueling hours, far longer than anticipated. Ice chunks the size of millstones battered the boats, threatening to crush both vessels and passengers. Men used their musket butts and bayonets to push away the frozen obstacles, their hands growing numb despite their woolen mittens. Washington himself stood in the bow of one boat. His imposing 6'2" frame a beacon of determination for his struggling soldiers. He had staked everything on this moment, knowing that failure would not only end his military career, but likely result in his execution as a traitor to the crown. The weight of an entire nation's hopes rested on his broad shoulders as the boats fought against the current and the cold. By 4 a.m. on December 26th, the last of the Continental forces had reached the New Jersey shore. They were behind schedule, soaked to the bone, and facing a 9-mile march through a howling nor'easter. 2 soldiers had already frozen to death during the crossing, their bodies left behind in the merciless river. Yet somehow, incredibly, Washington's gamble was still alive. Hessians at Trenton remained unaware that 3,000 vengeful, bloody Americans were trudging through the snow toward their comfortable quarters. The revolution's fate now hung on the next few hours. The cobblestones of Trenton glistened with fresh snow as Colonel Johann Raoul dismissed the latest warning from his scouts. The Hessian commander, flushed with wine from Christmas celebrations, waved away concerns about rebel activity with characteristic German confidence. His 1,500 mercenaries had earned their fearsome reputation across European battlefields, and he saw no reason to fear a rabble of colonial farmers, especially not in such weather. Washington's forces had split into 3 columns for the assault, though only his own would successfully reach the town. As dawn broke on December 26, 1776, the Continental Army emerged from the swirling snow like specters of revolution. Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery unlimbered at the head of King Street, their cannons loaded with grapeshot that would turn the wide avenue into a killing field. The attack began with a thunderous roar as American artillery opened fire, shattering the morning stillness and the Hessian sense of security. Raoul stumbled from his headquarters, still in his nightclothes, shouting orders in German as his confused soldiers poured into the streets. The mercenaries had expected to face the usual disorganized colonial militia, not the disciplined force that now systematically seized control of their town. Hamilton's guns dominated the main streets while Continental infantry poured through, side alleys, their bayonets fixed, and their faces grim with purpose. The Hessians attempted to form defensive lines, but the Americans had achieved complete tactical surprise. Within minutes, the mercenaries found themselves trapped in a deadly crossfire, with no clear avenue of escape. Colonel Rowell, mortally wounded, while trying to rally his men, gasped out his final orders before collapsing in the snow. His death effectively ended organized Hessian resistance, though pockets of fighting continued for another hour. When the smoke cleared, Washington had captured nearly 900 prisoners, 30 officers, and crucial supplies including 6 brass cannons that his army desperately needed, more importantly than the material gains. However, was the psychological impact of the victory. News of Trenton spread like wildfire throughout the colonies, rekindling the revolutionary flame that had nearly guttered out. Recruitment stations that had stood empty for weeks suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with volunteers, eager to join Washington's resurgent cause. According to historian David Hackett, Fisher's acclaimed work Washington's Crossing, this victory marked the psychological turning point of the entire war, transforming the Continental Army from a fleeing rabble into a force capable of defeating professional European soldiers. The triumph at Trenton proved that American forces could stand against the world's finest military units when properly led and motivated. But Washington knew that one victory, however spectacular, would not be enough. British General Charles Cornwallis was already marching south from New York with 8,000 veteran troops, intent on crushing the rebellion before it could gain further momentum. The Continental Army had perhaps 48 hours before facing a force nearly 3 times its size, commanded by one of Britain's most capable generals. As his soldiers celebrated their hard-won triumph, Washington was already planning his next move. The element of surprise had served him well at Trenton, but it would be much harder to achieve against Cornwallis, who would not underestimate the Americans again. The general's strategic mind was already turning toward Princeton, where a smaller British force might provide another opportunity for victory before the full weight of the Crown's military might descended upon them. General Charles Cornwallis received word of the Trenton disaster while attending a farewell dinner in New York, preparing for his scheduled return to England. The veteran commander who had earned his reputation in the 7 Years' War immediately canceled his departure and began marshaling his forces. By January 1st, 1777, he was leading 5,500 crack British troops south through New Jersey, determined to trap Washington's army and end the rebellion once and for all. The British advance was methodical and overwhelming. Cornwallis deployed his forces in a massive sweep designed to pin the Continental Army against the Delaware River, where the Americans would have no choice but to fight a conventional battle they could not win. His confidence was justified. Washington's army, even reinforced by militia and the Trenton prisoners who had agreed to switch sides, numbered fewer than 5,000 men, many of whom were poorly equipped and inadequately trained. Washington found himself in an impossible position. His army occupied Trenton, but Cornwallis was approaching with superior numbers and professional soldiers, who would not be caught off guard like the Hessians had been. The Delaware crossing points were all under British observation, making retreat extremely difficult. A direct confrontation would likely result in the complete destruction of the Continental Army and the effective end of the Revolution. The American commander spent the evening of January 2nd walking among his troops, studying their faces by firelight. These men had followed him across an ice-choked river and defeated professional soldiers in their first major victory of the war, and it deserved better than to be sacrificed in a hopeless last stand. There had to be another option, another audacious gamble that might yet save the cause. As Cornwallis's forces took position south of a Sun-Pink Creek, Washington gathered his senior officers for a desperate council of war. The British had deployed with typical precision, blocking all obvious escape routes while maintaining their own lines of communication. Back to New York, their campfires dotted the hillsides like stars, a visible reminder of the overwhelming force. Arrayed against the Americans, Captain John Fitzgerald suggested a night withdrawal across the Delaware. But Washington shook his head. The British had learned from Trenton and were watching the river crossings too carefully. Colonel Joseph Reed proposed a fighting retreat northward that would only delay the inevitable confrontation while costing precious lives. It was General Hugh Mercer who first voiced the possibility that would change everything. What about Princeton? The suggestion seemed almost insane. Princeton lay 18 miles northeast of Trenton, behind Cornwallis's army and dangerously close to British strongholds. A march in that direction would expose the Continental Army's flank to attack, and potentially trap them even more completely than they already were. Yet as Washington studied his maps by candlelight, he began to see the possibilities hidden within the apparent madness. Princeton was lightly defended, garrisoned by only 3 regiments under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood. More importantly, it controlled the main road between New York and Philadelphia, making it a crucial strategic point that the British could not afford to lose. If Washington could seize Princeton, it would force Cornwallis to abandon his advantageous position and come after him, potentially creating opportunities for future victories. The plan that emerged from that midnight conference was even more daring than the Trenton crossing had been. Washington would leave skeleton forces to maintain his campfires and create the illusion of continued occupation, then march the bulk of his army on a wide flanking movement through the frozen countryside. To strike Princeton at dawn, the temperature plummeted to near zero as Washington's army began its most perilous gamble yet. At 1 o'clock in the morning on January 3rd, 1777, the Continental forces slipped away from their Trenton positions in absolute silence. Wagon wheels were wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound, and officers moved among the ranks with whispered threats for any man who made unnecessary noise. The success of the entire operation depended on maintaining the deception that the army remained in position, ready to face Cornwallis in the morning. General Hugh Mercer led the advance guard, Virginia and Maryland troops picking their way along frozen farm tracks that had been chosen specifically because they avoided the main roads where British patrols might be encountered. Behind them, the main body of the Continental Army stretched out in a column nearly 2 miles long, each man stepping carefully in the footprints of the soldier, ahead to minimize the visible signs of their passage. The march route took the Americans through some of the most challenging terrain in New Jersey. Frozen streams had to be forded with men breaking through the ice up to their waists, then continuing to march with their clothes freezing solid against their bodies. Hills that would have been merely steep in summer became treacherous obstacles when covered with packed snow and ice. Several artillery pieces became stuck in snowdrifts and had to be manhandled free by teams of soldiers, whose hands were too numb to feel the rope burns they were inflicting on themselves. Washington rode along the length of his column throughout the night, encouraging stragglers and ensuring that the pace remained steady despite the horrific conditions. His personal example was crucial to maintaining morale. If the commanding general could endure the same hardships as the common soldiers, then they could find the strength to continue. Several men collapsed from exhaustion and exposure, but their comrades carried them forward rather than abandoning them. To freeze to death in the New Jersey wilderness, by 4 in the morning, the army had covered nearly 15 miles of the 18-mile journey to Princeton. They were behind schedule again, just as they had been during the Delaware crossing, but this time the delay might prove catastrophic. Dawn would reveal their movement to any British observers, and Cornwallis would undoubtedly pursue them with his superior force once he discovered the deception. The final approach to Princeton required crossing open farmland where concealment would be impossible once the sun rose. Washington made the crucial decision to push forward despite the growing light, gambling that they could complete their mission. Before British reinforcements arrived, the Continental Army was committed now. There could be no turning back, even if they encountered unexpected resistance. As the first pale light of dawn touched the snow-covered fields around Princeton, scouts reported that the town appeared quiet, with no unusual military activity visible. The British garrison seemed to be following their normal routine, unaware that 3,000 American soldiers were approaching from an entirely unexpected direction. Washington's impossible night march had succeeded in achieving tactical surprise. Once again, the general deployed his forces carefully as they reached the outskirts of Princeton. Mercer's brigade would attack the main British position while Sullivan's men swept around to cut off retreat routes. The artillery, dragged through 18 miles of frozen hell, would provide fire support from commanding positions overlooking the town Everything depended on speed and coordination. They had to overwhelm the British garrison before organized resistance could develop, as the Continental Army prepared for battle. Washington could see the spires of Princeton in the distance. Silhouetted against the brightening sky, in less than an hour, this quiet college town would become the site of another crucial test for American independence. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood was reviewing morning reports in his Princeton headquarters when the first musket shots crackled. Across the frozen fields, the British commander initially assumed his foraging parties had encountered local militia, a common occurrence that rarely amounted to serious fighting. He had no reason to suspect that Washington's entire army was bearing down on his 3 undermanned regiments from an impossible direction. General Hugh Mercer's brigade advanced through the William Clark Orchard, their breath steaming in the frigid air as they approached the Stony Brook Bridge. The Virginia and Maryland veterans moved with the quiet confidence of men who had already proven themselves at Trenton, their bayonets gleaming in the pale morning light. They expected to sweep aside light resistance and occupy Princeton before the British could organize effective opposition instead. They collided head-on with Mawhood's 17th Foot, which was marching out of Princeton toward Trenton to reinforce Cornwallis. The two forces encountered each other at perhaps 50 yards distance, close enough to see individual faces before the deadly volleying began. The British regulars, though surprised by the American presence, maintained their professional discipline and delivered coordinated fire that tore through Mercer's front ranks. The fighting in the orchard was savage and desperate. Bare tree branches provided minimal cover as both sides stood in the open, trading volleys at point-blank range. Horse was shot from under him, and as he struggled to his feet, a British bayonet thrust caught him in the abdomen. The beloved general, one of Washington's most trusted subordinates, fell mortally wounded among the apple trees he had been trying to capture. According to the detailed account preserved in the Princeton Battlefield Society's archives, the loss of Mercer created a critical moment when American resistance might have collapsed entirely. His brigade began to waver as word of their commander's fall spread through the ranks. The British, sensing opportunity, pressed forward with their bayonets, driving the Americans back toward the main Continental Army positions. Washington himself arrived at the critical moment, spurring his white charger directly into the melee. The commanding general placed himself between his retreating troops and the advancing British, his imposing figure unmistakable even in the smoke and confusion of battle. "Parade with us, my brave fellows," he shouted, his voice carrying over the musket fire. "There is but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." The sight of their commander exposing himself to enemy fire galvanized the Continental soldiers. Veterans who had been falling back suddenly found their courage renewed while fresh troops rushed forward to support their general. Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery battery unlimbered on a slight rise, sending grapeshot into the British ranks at devastating close range. The tide of battle began to shift as American numbers started to tell. Mawhood's forces, though professional and disciplined, found themselves increasingly outnumbered as more Continental units arrived on the battlefield. The British commander made the difficult decision to withdraw his main force toward New Brunswick, leaving behind a rear guard to cover the retreat. His 40th Foot took position in Nassau Hall, the main building of the College of New Jersey. Turning the academic structure into a fortress, the fighting around Nassau Hall represented something unique in the American Revolution. A direct assault on a fortified position by Continental troops who had learned to fight like European soldiers, rather than guerrilla militia. Hamilton's cannons were brought forward to blast the heavy wooden doors, while infantry formed up for a coordinated assault that would have been impossible for Washington's army to execute just months earlier. When the smoke cleared, Princeton belonged to the Americans. The British garrison had been scattered, with significant casualties and nearly 300 prisoners taken. More importantly, Washington had achieved his second stunning victory in 10 days, proving that Trenton had not been a fluke, but rather evidence of the Continental Army's growing competence and confidence. Yet even as his soldiers celebrated, Washington knew that time was running out. Cornwallis would discover the deception within hours and pursue them with overwhelming force. The Battle of Princeton was won, but the larger strategic situation remained perilous. General Charles Cornwallis, awoke on the morning of January 3rd to discover that his prey had vanished in the night. The American campfires still smoldered across the Sunpink Creek, and sentries reported occasional movement in the continental positions, but something felt wrong. When advance patrols finally crossed the creek under cover of fog, they found only a handful of American soldiers tending fires built to deceive British observers. Washington's entire army had simply evaporated. The British commander's initial reaction was disbelief, then grudging admiration for the audacity of his opponent. Washington had executed a maneuver that violated every principle of conventional military wisdom, marching his inferior force across the front of a superior enemy to strike at an entirely unexpected target. It was the kind of operation that should have resulted in disaster, yet somehow the Americans had pulled it off. Cornwallis immediately grasped the strategic implications. Princeton controlled the main road between New York and Philadelphia, making it far more valuable than Trenton had ever been. If Washington consolidated his position there, he could threaten British communications throughout New Jersey and potentially launch attacks against other isolated garrisons. The rebellion, which had seemed nearly crushed just days earlier, was showing disturbing signs of renewed vitality. The British general ordered an immediate pursuit, but his forces were scattered across southern New Jersey and would need hours to concentrate for an effective advance. His artillery was positioned for the siege of Trenton that would no longer be necessary. While his cavalry was exhausted from weeks of continuous operations, Washington had gained precious time through his deception, and Cornwallis was learning. To his cost, that time was the most valuable commodity in this unconventional war. As the British columns finally began their march toward Princeton, Washington was facing a crucial decision of his own. His army held the town, but they were desperately short of supplies and ammunition. Many of his men had been marching and fighting for nearly 36 hours with minimal rest, and their effectiveness was declining rapidly. Most critically, his soldiers' enlistments were still set to expire at midnight, potentially leaving him with a skeleton force, just as Cornwallis arrived with overwhelming numbers. The American commander gathered his senior officers in Nassau Hall, the same building his artillery had blasted just hours earlier. The Grand Chamber, with its portraits of English kings looking down on the rebel council, provided an ironic setting for discussions about the survival of American independence. Washington's options were limited and dangerous. Stand and fight against impossible odds, retreat toward the Delaware and risk being caught in the open, or attempt another impossible maneuver that might yet salvage victory from near certain defeat. General Nathanael Greene argued for immediate withdrawal toward the Watchung Mountains, where the Continental Army could establish winter quarters in defensible terrain. Colonel John Cadwalader advocated for a fighting retreat that would inflict maximum casualties on the pursuing British. But it was General Arthur St. Clair who proposed the strategy that would ultimately be adopted. March immediately toward Morristown, where supplies were cached and the mountainous terrain would provide natural protection against conventional attack. The decision to abandon Princeton was agonizing for Washington, who understood that retreating after 2 victories might appear to contradict the very success they had achieved. Yet strategic wisdom demanded that he preserve his army for future operations rather than sacrifice it in a hopeless last stand. The Revolution needed the Continental Army to survive more than it needed to hold any particular piece of ground, no matter how symbolically important. By noon on January 3rd, the Americans were evacuating Princeton, their withdrawal covered by rear guards who destroyed bridges and felled trees across the roads to slow British pursuit. Washington had achieved something remarkable. He had fought 2 successful battles in 10 days, captured nearly 1,100 prisoners, seized crucial supplies, and demonstrated that American forces could defeat professional European soldiers. In conventional combat, the race to Morristown would determine whether these victories translated into lasting strategic advantage or merely delayed the inevitable collapse of the revolutionary cause. The frozen roads, too. Morristown echoed with the tramp of British boots as Cornwallis pushed his forces in desperate pursuit of Washington's elusive army. The British general had committed his entire available force to this chase, understanding that failure to destroy the Continental Army now might prolong the rebellion indefinitely. His soldiers, veterans of European campaigns, were frustrated by an enemy that refused to stand and fight according to accepted military conventions. Washington's retreat was masterfully conducted, with rearguards fighting delaying actions at every defensible position while the main army escaped deeper into the New Jersey wilderness. The Americans had learned hard lessons about mobility and deception, applying tactics that would later be recognized as precursors to modern guerrilla warfare. Each stream crossing was contested, each bridge destroyed after the Continental forces passed, each hill defended just long enough to impose delay without risking serious casualties. By January 6, 1777, Washington's army had reached the security of the Wokong Mountains around Morristown. The terrain was so difficult that conventional European tactics became impossible. Any attempt to assault the American positions would require attacking uphill through narrow defiles where superior numbers meant nothing. Cornwallis, after probing the defenses and finding them impregnable, made the reluctant decision to withdraw his forces to winter quarters around New York. The immediate military consequences of Princeton were significant, but not decisive. Washington had captured supplies, prisoners, and territory while inflicting humiliating defeats on professional European forces.
More importantly,
He had demonstrated that the Continental Army could execute complex maneuvers and fight conventional battles. When properly led and motivated, the raggedy colonial militia had evolved into something approaching a real army. But the true revolution, created by Princeton, was psychological and political rather than purely military. News of the twin victories at Trenton and Princeton spread throughout the colonies with electric speed, rekindling revolutionary enthusiasm that had nearly died during the disasters of late 1776. Recruitment stations that had stood empty for months suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with volunteers eager to serve under the general who had proven that Americans could defeat the world's finest soldiers. The international implications were equally profound. European observers, particularly in France, had been watching the American rebellion with skeptical interest, doubting that colonial forces could mount effective resistance against British professional military power. Princeton changed those calculations entirely. French Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes began serious discussions about providing military aid to the Americans. Recognizing that the rebellion might succeed if properly supported, according to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the French National Archives, King Louis XVI's government began covert arms shipments to the Americans within weeks of receiving reports about Princeton. These weapons and supplies would prove crucial in subsequent campaigns, ultimately leading to the formal French alliance that made American independence possible. Princeton had demonstrated that supporting the American cause was a worthwhile investment rather than a hopeless gesture. The British response revealed how seriously they took Washington's transformation from fleeing rebel to dangerous adversary. General William Howe abandoned his plans for winter offensive operations, instead consolidating his forces in defensive positions around New York. The confident advance across New Jersey was reversed as British garrisons evacuated outlying posts, effectively ceding control of most of the colony to American forces within the Continental Army itself. Princeton marked the moment when soldiers began to believe they could actually win the war. The psychological impact of defeating professional European troops in conventional battle created a confidence that would sustain the force through subsequent hardships and defeats. These men had proven themselves against the best the British Empire could deploy, and that knowledge would carry them through the darkest moments of the campaigns to come. As Washington established his winter headquarters in Morristown, he could reflect on 10 days that had transformed the character of the entire revolution. The desperate gamble across the Delaware had led to victories that changed everything: international perceptions, domestic morale, enemy strategy, and the Continental Army's belief in itself. The Battle of Princeton, though less famous than Trenton, had proven that the first victory was no accident. America was no longer fighting merely to survive, it was fighting to win. The revolution that had seemed nearly dead on Christmas Day, 1776, was now fully alive, thanks to a lesser-known battle that flipped the entire trajectory of the war toward independence.